little while about wisdom and judgment. Our knowledge often exceeds our judgment. And that is, we have knowledge. We may have knowledge of the Word. We may know our Bible. We may know what it teaches. Maybe other subjects we have great knowledge. But we may be lacking often in judgment. There's a continual need to revisit what the Bible says about wisdom and judgment. Many of our problems are brought on not by sinful decisions and actions, but by simply using bad judgment. Someone has said good judgment comes from experience, and experience, well, that comes from using bad judgment. How true. That does happen time and again. And part of the struggle of bad judgment or wisdom and judgment is that those with poor judgment do not always know they're using bad judgment. Or they would quit using that and use better judgment. They're using bad judgment, but they don't have a clue that it's bad judgment. And that's part of the struggle with that. We would all agree with this principle. The Bible gives us wisdom. You read the Bible, you study the Bible, you know the Bible, that grants us wisdom. But wisdom is not always found in a book. What we mean by that is not something that you can go learn in a crash course. You can't go over to the local college, community college, and say, I want to take a couple of semesters in wisdom, and then you walk away and you're a person of wisdom and judgment. You don't learn it in a crash course. You're not going to buy a book and decide, I'm going to read this book, and when I've read this book, now I have wisdom, and therefore I have good judgment. Wisdom and judgment can't be bought at a store. You can't go to Walmart and say, I want a box of wisdom, or I'll take a whole case of wisdom, or give me the whole truckload of wisdom. I can't do that. It'd be nice if we could do that and distribute it, but that's not the case. Let's talk about wisdom and judgment tonight, and let's begin with this. We often struggle knowing what wisdom is. What is wisdom? Let's start with this. Let's understand that wisdom involves far more, and good judgment involves far more than things that are not sinful. What do we mean by that? Let's turn to Colossians 1 and in verse 9. Let's get the picture of what Colossians 1 and verse 9 says. For this reason also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you and to ask that you be filled with the knowledge of His will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. Now notice he talks about the knowledge of His will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. Brother Weaver, in his commentary on the book of Philippians, made this observation, and he's spot on, I think. Speaking of the one who has this, not only the knowledge, but wisdom and all spiritual understanding, he will not only do what is in his spiritual interest, or what is good for him on a spiritual level. Some things, even right in themselves, are not best for the Christian. It does not necessarily take all wisdom and spiritual understanding to know the difference between right and wrong, or the good and the bad. But it does require such wisdom and understanding to know the better over the good, and the best over the better, and having recognized the difference to make the best choice rather than just refuse the bad. He is spot on. What does it mean by that? Well, quite often this is the concept we have. And that is, there's a category of things that are sinful, and if it's not sinful, then it must be good and right. So here is some decision or some action that I'm taking. And I've decided to take this action, or here is some decision that I have made. And the idea behind some people is simply this, that since it's not in the sinful category, then there's no problem at all. Let me give you some for instances. It might be dating someone that's not a Christian. Or maybe you're thinking of marrying a non-Christian. And so someone may question, so you know what, can you show me in the Bible where that's sinful? Can you shove that over in the sinful category? Well, no, I can't say that's absolutely sinful. All right, since it's not sinful, then there's not a thing wrong with it, and so therefore it's good and it's right. Well, that's not the case at all. We'll see more about that in a moment. Or maybe it's the place of employment. You're trying to make a decision about where you go. You can take a job at this place, Or you can take a job over here. But what about this place you've been warned about being an employee there because of the environment? And you say, is it sinful to work there? Well, no, it's not sinful, but it may not be the best judgment. Or it may be another matter like your friends that you're choosing. Or maybe it's a career choice that you're making. And somebody wants to know, is it sinful? Well, no, it's not sinful. This decision and action, since it's not sinful, then there's not a problem with it at all. That's not the biblical picture of Colossians 1 and verse 9. What Colossians 1 and verse 9 is saying that besides things that are just a matter of knowledge, or things that are right and wrong versus sin versus things that are right with God, there are matters that are bad judgment, and then there's better judgment and the best judgment. Meaning that here is that decision I'm thinking about, or here is this action I'm involved in. While it may not involve sin, it may be the poorest of judgment. There's a difference in something being sinful and being good judgment. It may be the poorest of judgment. So what I'm trying to establish for you is, when we're talking about wisdom, it involves more than things just not sinful. Just because it's not sinful doesn't mean it's the wise course. But let's go a step further. It involves more than knowledge. Wisdom involves more than just knowledge. Now let's go back to our text in Colossians 1 and in verse 9. Remember, he talks about, for this reason, since the day that we heard it, did not cease to pray for you, that you be filled with the knowledge of his will. That's one thing. In all wisdom and spiritual understanding. Knowledge is one thing, but spiritual wisdom and understanding may be something entirely different. The term wisdom is used in more than one sense in the Bible. In Proverbs 4, the Bible uses the term wisdom in the sense of God's revelation. That wisdom is the principal thing. What's he talking about? Well, look at the context of Proverbs 1 to 9. All of those chapters 1 through 9, wisdom is used in the sense of God's revelation. But in James 1 and verse 5, the term wisdom is used in the sense of judgment or insight. We'll define that a little more later. What I'm trying to describe for you is that wisdom does not always involve matters of knowledge. Knowledge is one thing, wisdom is entirely something different. Let me illustrate the difference in a number of matters. Knowledge involves knowing what the Word teaches, knowing what the Word says, what the revelation of God says, but wisdom may have to do with how much you teach at one time and how you approach the person. A number of years ago, I had a whole Bible study going, and I had a brother in the congregation asked could he go with me, and I said, sure. And he was a very knowledgeable man. So we sat down and had the Bible study, and the question came up. I don't remember now what the question was, but the answer was found in Daniel 2. Something about the kingdom. And so this brother said, let me answer that for this fellow we're studying with. Let me answer. And I said, okay. So he said, now, the answer to that's found over here in Daniel 2, but he said, you won't really understand Daniel 2 unless you understand the book of Daniel and the background of Daniel. So he talked about 10 minutes about the background to Daniel. And then he said, you know what, you really wouldn't understand Daniel if you didn't understand the prophets that came before. Jeremiah, for example, prophesied before him, and we spent 10 minutes talking about Jeremiah. 20 minutes after the question was asked, this brother turned to me and he said, I forgot the question. What was the question? I said, I don't remember it either. He destroyed the Bible study. Knowledge? Yes. Did he use wisdom in how much information to give and how to disseminate that information? He had no judgment at all. Do you see the difference in knowledge and judgment? For example, the thing we're using here this evening, how to use PowerPoint. One might have great knowledge of how to use this kind of equipment, but wisdom is how much flashy animation do you use? Do you dazzle the audience with how fancy it is? That's wisdom. Judgment. You might know the value of jewelry. I don't know anything about that. Knowledge of the value of jewelry is one thing. Whether you comment or what you say about someone's jewelry is a matter of judgment. Do you look and say, wow, he must be rich. That's very expensive. Oh, that sure is cheap. That has to do with judgment. See, there's a difference in knowledge and judgment. You may know how to do something better than someone else, but how you handle that knowledge is a matter of judgment. A number of years ago, I do a good bit of carpentry work. I have for a number of years, but One of the brethren in the church asked me, could I borrow your miter saw? I want to put up crown mold in my house. And so I loaned him my miter saw, and then a few days later I went over to visit him, and he said, look here, I did all this myself, and he showed me his crown mold. And as I looked up, my knowledge said, you put every bit of it upside down. Wisdom said, don't tell him. There's a difference in knowledge and wisdom. You might learn something about somebody else's money, even accidentally. So now you have knowledge that they're having financial struggles. But wisdom has to do with whether or not you tell them. Do I repeat that? Do I tell it to someone else? Do I approach them and say, I learned and I now know you're in trouble? There's a difference in knowledge and wisdom. Someone said, knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. Big difference in knowledge and wisdom. Still defining the idea of wisdom. Wisdom has to do with being able to see beyond the present. I said we'd come back to this. Let's go to James chapter 1 and in verse 5. At the opening of the book of James, James talks about how that the trials and the tribulations and the persecution, there is some value in that. That's hard to see, isn't it? So let's see what he says. He says, look at verse 3, or verse 2, knowing, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, he said. Well, why would you count it all joy? Well, look at verse 3, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. In other words, the trials and the tribulation and the persecution you receive, there is some value in that. That's hard to see. Now look at verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. What does it mean, ask of God? What does it mean if you lack wisdom? He hasn't shifted gears and said all of a sudden, now let's talk about wisdom and judgment. We've been talking about persecution, let's talk about judgment. That's not what he's doing. What he's saying is that you need the wisdom to be able to see the good in the suffering at the present. In other words, I'm suffering now, but looking down the road, I can see some value in this. This is going to make me a better person. So wisdom has to do with insight. Wisdom has to do with being able to see beyond the present. Let's go further. Wisdom has to do with being mature in our judgment. Being mature in our judgment. The glory of the old man is the gray head. Now the point of that is, in Proverbs 20 and verse 29, the point of that is not if your hair turns gray, that's just a great thing. What he's saying, with the gray hair comes some maturity. There is some glory. Man, the strength of the young man is, the glory of the young man is his strength. He can say, I'm stronger than Dad is. I'm stronger than Granddad. But Granddad and Dad, they can say, you know what, I've got a little wisdom here. I've been down the road. I've been around the block or two. James 1 and in verse 4, verse 4 talks about being perfect in what sense? Well, look at verse 4, he said, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect, complete, lacking nothing. The idea of perfect is the idea of mature, so that you can be mature. Hebrews chapter 5 talks about being those who are full age can discern good and evil. That maturity level where you can make some discernment. Let's go to the book of Proverbs, if you will. Go to the book of Proverbs, the 16th division, and notice in verse 31. Proverbs 16 and in verse 31. What I want you to see is that age does not always mean wisdom and good judgment. The silver head is a crown of glory. Well, that's true. But now notice what else he says. If it is found in the way of righteousness. Having gray hair is glory. If it's found in the way of righteousness. Age does not always mean wisdom and good judgment. Only if wisdom and judgment is focused in the right direction. Someone has correctly said wisdom does not always come with age. Sometimes age comes all by itself, and it does in some cases. The idea of having wisdom has to do with being sober-minded. Look at a few passages here. We'll not take the time to notice the details of each one, but Titus 1 talks about elders are to be sober-minded. Titus 2, older men are to be the same thing, sober-minded. Titus 2 and verse 6, younger men are to be sober-minded. What does it mean to be sober-minded? It means to be of a sound mind. It says serious, level-headed. It's translated being in his right mind. This idea of having a level head. Whereas you use some judgment and use some wisdom and you have good judgment. Sober-minded is the concept. So here's what I'm seeing. That is, what is wisdom? We struggle in figuring out what wisdom is. It involves far more than just things that are not sinful. It has to do with far more than having knowledge. Wisdom involves maturity in judgment, being able to see beyond the present, and having this mature or sober mind. Now I know what it is. We also struggle in knowing its sources. In other words, where do I get wisdom? Where do I find wisdom? And how do I know what the wise course is? I'm debating on whether to do this or this, and how do I know which one of those is the wise course? How do I know? Where do you find wisdom? And I know Brother so-and-so, he's got wisdom, but how do I get the wisdom that he's got? I don't know. Well, let's start with the Word of God itself. We need to have our knowledge of the Bible. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6. This was a favorite section for the Jews. This was in Moses' second sermon that he was preaching before they embarked on the crossing of the river. And his emphasis in chapter 6 is the place and the purpose of the law. And one of the things he's instilling in them is you take this law and you put it down into your heart, and then you teach it diligently to your children. Look at verse 6, Deuteronomy 6 and verse 6. These words which I command you shall be in your heart. That's not memorizing the word. That's not the idea. That's great and good, but it shall be in your heart. You take it and make it a part of your will. You make it a part of your life. You make it a part of everything that you do. And you shall teach them diligently to your children. And you shall talk of them when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, when you rise up. In other words, you fill your own heart with the word, and then you turn around and saturate the hearts of your children with the word. Well, Ephesians 3, verses 3 to 5 talks about, when you read, you may understand my knowledge of the mystery of Christ. 2 Peter 3:18, but grow in the grace and in the knowledge of the Lord. And you say, what does that have to do with wisdom? We see every decision that I make, every kind of decision that I ever embark upon, those decisions that I focus upon should be aimed to harmonize with and accomplish the goal that's found within the Word. So I become familiar with the Word, and my goal is I want to be strong spiritually. Well, the wise course is that which yields its way toward that spiritual strength. Is this going to make me weaker spiritually or stronger spiritually? So maybe it's a job decision. I can take this job in a city where there are a number of faithful Christians, or maybe I can take this job where there's not a strong church in the area. Which one is more conducive to my spiritual strength? Because that's the goal I read about in the Scriptures. It doesn't take a Solomon to figure that out, does it? Or maybe my goal is I want to raise my children to walk in the fear of God. I've been reading about that in the Scriptures. Raising your children to walk in the fear of God. So do I let them go to this movie? I don't know if this is the wise thing. It's not sinful to let them go, but should I let them go? Well, is it going to be conducive to raising them in the fear of God? You say, well, it really not going to help that at all. In fact, it may hinder that. Well, then there's your judgment and there's your wisdom. Do I let them have these friends? Is it going to help them to walk in the fear of God, or is it going to be a hindrance to them walking in the fear of God? Or maybe I find the goal in the Scriptures, I want to be pure. And so should I listen to this music? Well, it may not be sinful to listen to that, but it may not be conducive to my living the pure life. The wisdom books can help us. Let's go to the book of Proverbs. I can learn a lot of wisdom just from reading the wisdom literature. Let's go to Proverbs. This is a classic right here in Proverbs 18 and in verse 13. He that answers a matter before he hears it is folly and shame to him. When you draw conclusions before you got all the information, that's not wise. Wisdom says, you know what, I've got a little information, but I want to hear the rest of the story before I get and draw my conclusion. Look at verse 17. This is a gem of wisdom. The first to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him. Someone comes and they tell you their side of the story when there's a difference. Don't jump to the conclusion they're right. There's another side to that story. Verse 17 says, listen to the other side. So I learned some wisdom just by reading the wisdom books. Stephen Covey said, whatever is at the center of your life will be the source of our security, guidance, and wisdom and power. So if your friends of the world are the center of your life, that's what your life centers around, that's the source of your wisdom. You make the Word of God the center of your life, that's the source of your wisdom. So where do I get it? Well, start with the Word of God itself. Second, in the multitude of counselors. Let's go back to the book of Proverbs. Go to the 11th chapter in verse 14. We don't need to read all three of these. They all say essentially the same thing. For Proverbs 11 and in verse 14 said, where there is no counsel, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety. But we see the same thing in 15 and in verse 22. Without counsel, plans go around, the multitude of counselors they are established. And again, 24 and verse 6. What does that mean? That means I need to ask for advice from more than just one. I need to ask for advice from more than just one. I must be open to a different judgment. I need to do more than just try to find confirmation of what I've already decided. I want to do X, so I go and talk to the fellow that I think is going to tell me that X is okay. I might want to talk to somebody that I know is going to tell me X is wrong, because I want to know what his reasoning is. Can he move me off of that? Can you give me a good reason why I shouldn't do that? That's the value of having a multitude of counselors. Tyron Edwards said, he that never changes his opinion, never corrects his mistakes, and will never be wiser tomorrow than he is today. If you're never open to another form of judgment, to another side of a matter of judgment, you will never be any wiser. Because multitude of counselors is one of the ways we learn. Experience teaches us that. You see, we learn from experience. It's like Genesis 30 and verse 27. This is where Laban said to Jacob, I have learned by experience. Haven't we all? Elders learn from experience. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5. They learn from the experience of dealing with their own children how to deal with others. And so you learn some wisdom from experience. You go down this road and you realize, you know what, that was the wrong way to handle that. You just learn some wisdom that the next time you handle it differently. You said something that got you in trouble. Well, the next time you know not to say that. You just learned some wisdom from experience. Here's another source. Pray. You know what James 1 and verse 5 said? If any lack wisdom, let him ask of God. You want him to see the benefit of something? Pray to God to give you the wisdom of that. And we want to pray on a daily basis, God, give me wisdom. Be specific in the areas where you want wisdom. God, give me wisdom, please, in the decision I'm about to make about my job. Give me wisdom in the decision I'm about to make about this marriage. God, give me the wisdom that I might make right decisions in handling my children. Help me to know when to spank them and when not to spank them. When to comfort and when to console and when to condemn. When to be tolerant and when to be hard. Those are hard decisions. God, grant me the wisdom. I know what wisdom is. I know its sources now. Let's talk about knowing where it's needed. All of us would admit, yeah, we need wisdom, but when it comes to where the rubber hits the road, we may not realize this is one of those areas where I need wisdom right here. I need to put it to use. One of those areas is in raising children. Our goal and our objective should be that we want to raise our children, again, to walk in the fear of God. Train a child in the way that he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. Proverbs 22. Ephesians 6. Bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So what does that mean? It means I need to be very careful in the decisions I make about my children. Sometimes I think we raise our children in a careless direction, like we're just assuming everything's going to turn out all right, rather than raising our children like we're scared to death they're not going to turn out. That means if I'm using wisdom in the rearing of my children, I need to be watchful of what they're doing, who they're with, who they're talking to, their emails they get, the music they listen to, the movies they watch, what they're doing on Facebook and on Twitter and Instagram and all the other social media. You're the parent, you have a right to see that. My children were small, you can't delete your emails. I want to read every one of your emails before you delete anything. Facebook wasn't the big thing then. That's a long time ago when my kids were small. But I want to see what's going on Facebook. I want to see what your Instagram account is saying. I want to know what you're doing. I want to see what others are saying to you. I want to know what movie you're going to see, because I want to look it up and find out all the language that's used. I want to know what kind of scenes are there. I want to know if it's it before you go. That's the child, or that's the parent who's watching their children and using some wisdom in the rearing of their children. Let's go to Colossians chapter 4. We need wisdom as we deal with others. not only in rearing our children, we need some wisdom just in how to approach other people. Let's go to the book of Colossians, if you will, chapter 4. And in verse 5, walk in wisdom toward those outside, redeeming the time. We need wisdom in knowing what to say to people. And not only what to say, but how you say it. It's not always what you say, it's how you say it. How you approach them. How do I respond when something is said to me? And when do I ignore some things and when do I reply? Do I try to reply to everything they said? Do I try to battle everything I disagree with? Or do I pick my battles? We need wisdom in knowing how to deal with other people. We need wisdom in how to conduct ourselves with the opposite sex. Proverbs 5 and verse 8 says, do not go near the door of her house. Do not go near the door of her house. In other words, stay clear. That's talking about the heart. Stay clear of a tempting circumstance. I want to tell you, there's been many of the gospel preachers got themselves in trouble because they went near to the door of the house. That is, he spent time with someone who was suffering from some marital problem, and he's consoling her, and he's comforting her, and he's giving her hugs to comfort her, and the next thing you know, they're falling in love. Stay clear of a tempting circumstance. Proverbs 6 talks about watching for the allurement. Do not let her allure you with her eyelids. Do not lust after her beauty in your heart. Watch for those allurements. Well, we need to raise the question, how does this situation look? Could it look mistaken? Am I putting myself in a circumstance that's going to be interpreted as I'm doing the wrong thing, I'm with the wrong person? Could this be a compromising circumstance? Or do I put all the blame on someone else, as we mentioned this morning, because they just misunderstood the circumstance I'm in? What does this look like? We need to be careful and use some wisdom about our dealing with the opposite sex. How close we become, how intimate we become. Things we talk about. Topics that are discussed, especially in mixed company. It's amazing to me sometimes in a mixed setting particularly, but it's even when it's unmixed. The kind of topics that will be brought up and discussed, that there is no judgment of the kind of things we'll discuss. We need to have wisdom and judgment. We need to have wisdom and judgment when we talk. Let's go to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 15 and in verse 1. A soft answer turns away wrath. You see, somebody's saying something to me that's really getting under my skin, and it could be I could use some wisdom and give a soft answer, and it kind of settles that down. Or I could come back hard and stir it up even more. We need some wisdom as we talk to people. Look at the very next verse. The tongue of the wise uses wisdom. If you have some wisdom, you're going to be careful what you say. Proverbs 17:28 says, the fool is wise when he holds his tongue. I like what Sam Levinson said. He said, it's so simple to be wise, just think of something stupid to say and then don't say it. You know what the proverb writer was saying? We need wisdom as we talk about it. We need wisdom in our timing. Let me give you a classic of this. Let's go to the book of Job. You remember Job and his friends were godly men who meant well, but they had some skewed thinking, obviously. And sometimes their timing just didn't go too well. Let's look at Job 5 and in verse 25. Remember, Job just lost all his children. Remember that? And here's Eliphaz. And Eliphaz said in Job 5, verse 25, you shall know that your descendants shall be many, and your offspring shall be like the grass of the earth. His timing stunk. That's like going to the funeral home with someone who's just lost their children and say, you know what, the Lord will bless you with more. Well, that may be true, but the timing of that stinks. Not always what we say, it's the timing of it. This wasn't the time. This wasn't the day. This was not the circumstance. You need to mention that. Sometimes our timing is off. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 talks about there's a time to laugh and there's a time to cry. And the time that you ought to be laughing is not the time that you need to be crying. The timing is off. And when everybody else is crying, that's not the time for you to tell your joke. That's so funny. And for you to be laughing. We need wisdom in our timing. We need wisdom in choosing our friends, who our friends are. Look at Proverbs 12 and in verse 26. The righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. In other words, it may not always be sinful that this is my friend, I spend time with this friend, but is that the wise course? I need to raise questions like, will they influence me to be weaker? Is that the friend I really need? Is this friend going to help me be stronger spiritually, or are they going to help me be weaker spiritually? Are they going to help me be stronger? Will they help break down the resistance? Psalm 1:1 talks about kind of a progression into sin. Are they going to break down that barrier so that I get closer and closer to sin, so that I'm more familiar with sin, and the next thing you know I'm doing? Are they going to help maintain that barrier between me and sin? Do they have the same standards I have? And are the problems that my friends, and I'll acknowledge, they've got problems and they do some things they shouldn't. Is it worse than anger? You say, why do you mention anger? Let's go to Proverbs 22. This has always been fascinating to me. Verse 24 and 25. Make no friends with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go. Well, what's interesting to me is he says, don't be friends with an angry man lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul. He didn't say don't go with a drunkard. Now, that's true, but that's not what this said. I can see I don't want to become like a drunkard. Don't go with a fornicator because you may become like a fornicator. But don't even go with an angry man. Your children came in and said, I've got this friend, but they don't drink, they don't smoke, they don't have premarital relationships, but they do have an anger issue. You said, well, that's not bad. And yet the proverb writer said, don't spend time with an angry man lest you learn his ways. So my question is, whatever problems your friend has, is it worse than anger? Because you weren't supposed to spend time with an angry man unless you learn his ways. I'm not even questioning whether it's sinful to be friends with them. Is it wise to be friends with them? That's the question. One last thing. We struggle with wisdom, knowing how to show our wisdom. The Bible tells us that we show our wisdom in our actions. Let's go to James chapter 3 and in verse 13. James chapter 3, verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in meekness of wisdom. How do I show wisdom? I show it in my actions, not by telling everybody how wise we are. I've always been Larry, the person who comes running and says, you need to listen to me. You need to listen to me. I've got some wisdom. I have been around. I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm talking about. I've got some wisdom. You know what? If you've got that much wisdom, I probably took note of that already. You don't have to tell me how wise you are. I'll know you're wise by your actions. Verse 13. You see, we show it in the decisions that we make and the things that we say. I know the so-and-so is wise because I've been watching the decisions and I notice how he words things, how he handles. Sister so-and-so is quite wise because every time I talk to her, she has words of wisdom and the decisions she has made tells me she's wise. If I've got to stand back and tell everybody how wise I am, I may be thinking that's not showing too well, not being demonstrated. You see, the problem with bad judgment is we're not thinking. We have a limited focus. We're not looking beyond, like James 1 and in verse 5 we've already discussed. We need to understand that we need to see consequences where things will lead. And can I be consistent? I love what G.B. Shaw said. He said, we're made wise not by the recollection of our past, but by our responsibility for our future. Amen. Back to James 1 and verse 5. We need to look to the future. And I need to ask some questions. Do I see dangers? Do I see dangers in the things that I have decided? How is this going to look to others? How are others being affected by this decision or this action? How am I going to come across? Maybe what I'm doing is fine, but I'm going to come across the wrong way. Am I setting a precedent? Quite often someone makes a suggestion, why don't you do X, Y, Z? It makes this to elders. You elders know that somebody says, why don't we go this direction? And they don't realize that they are just asking you to set a precedent that's going to be hard to follow the next year, the next year, and the next year. Or in another case. What are the consequences of what I'm allowing? When I allow my children to do this, what are the consequences of that? The problem with bad judgment is we're not looking to the future. We show our wisdom by not being rash, but by being deliberate. Let's look at a couple of passages that talk about this in the lesson of the years. Ecclesiastes 5 and in verse 2 says, do not be rash with your mouth. And do not let your heart utter anything hastily before God, for God is in heaven and you're on earth, and let your words be true. In other words, be careful. Be very careful. Be very careful about the promises you make. Be careful about what you say. Don't be too quick. Proverbs 15 verse 28 says, the heart of the righteous studies how to answer. That doesn't mean he's studying the text so he knows how to give an answer to a religious error. That's true. That's not what this text is talking about. But the righteous thinks before he speaks. He studies to answer. In other words, take time to answer. When someone asks a question or a problem is presented, if you're always quick on the spot, you've always got the answer, whether it's prepared or ready or not. That may not be wisdom. Take time to think things through. Is this really the right, wise course? Do I make this decision, or maybe I need to go the other course? I need not be quick in making decisions. Maybe I need to think about that a little bit. Maybe I need to sleep on that overnight and then make my decision, and then we go from there. Well, what have we seen in our study tonight? Well, we're quite often lacking in wisdom and in judgment. We struggle knowing what wisdom is, knowing where its sources are. Where do I go find it? How do I get a hold of it? How can I get some of it? And we struggle figuring out where we need it. And we also struggle with knowing how we show it. May God help us to have the wisdom we need, to be His servant, and to be helpful to those who are His servants. Amen. There may be more than one present this evening who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God, but you come tonight believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand?